The sun was hot that afternoon, and Marcus had just finished mowing the front lawn. His shirt was damp with sweat, and the smell of fresh-cut grass filled the air. He leaned against the handle of his mower, taking a deep breath, proud that his small yard looked neat and tidy. For him, these little chores were moments of peace, time away from the chaos of his job. He liked the quiet street, the children riding bikes, the sound of sprinklers spraying water over gardens. It felt safe, ordinary. At least, that was what he thought. Then came the knock. 3 heavy thuds on his front door. Not polite, not gentle, loud and commanding, like the sound of someone demanding entry. Marcus frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. His friends always called before they came. His neighbors usually just waved from their driveways. Something about that knock made his stomach tighten. He walked to the door, wiping his hands on his jeans, and pulled it open. Standing there were 2 men in dark uniforms. Their badges glinted in the sunlight, but something about them looked off, like the badges were cheap, the metal too dull, the emblems not quite right. Their faces were stern, their eyes hard. "Sir," the taller one said in a sharp voice, "you are under arrest for violating HOA rules. Step outside immediately." Marcus froze. For a moment he thought he had misheard. HOA, he repeated slowly. He didn't even live in a gated community with a homeowners association. His house was on a regular street, owned free and clear. He had no board to answer to, no rules about lawns or fences. "Yes," the man snapped. "You've been reported. Trespassing, noise violations, threats to neighbors. It's all written here." He held up a crumpled paper like it was proof of some great crime. Marcus's heart sank, not from fear, but from a familiar, heavy feeling. He had lived long enough to know what this was. It wasn't about lawnmowers or rules. It was about him, about the color of his skin, about the fact that he didn't fit the picture some people had of their neighborhood. He stood tall, looking at the men with calm eyes. "Noise violations from mowing my lawn?" His voice was quiet, almost gentle. The shorter officer smirked, stepping closer. "Don't play smart. We've had complaints. You can come quietly, or we can make this difficult." Marcus glanced around. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed curtains moving, neighbors peeking out from behind glass. A few of them stood openly in their yards, watching. Their faces told the story. They believed the men. To them, Marcus looked guilty. Already. Another black man caught doing something wrong. Another scene that would end badly. Inside, Marcus felt something break. Not fear, but disappointment. After everything he had done for this country, after all the sacrifices, after years of protecting people who would never know his name. Here, he was, reduced to a suspect on his own doorstep, accused by strangers pretending to be police. The taller man shoved a step forward. "Don't make us repeat ourselves. Step outside." Marcus stayed where he was. His jaw tightened, but his hands remained steady. He didn't want to give them the reaction they wanted. "You boys," he said softly, "really don't know what you're doing, do you?" The men laughed, ugly and harsh. "Oh, we know exactly what we're doing," the short one sneered. "People like you don't belong here, so we're taking you in." The words cut deep, not because they were new, but because they were old. Words Marcus had heard too many times in his life. Words meant to remind him that no matter what he achieved, no matter how hard he worked, some people would only ever see his skin first. But Marcus was not just any man. Behind his calm eyes and steady voice was a life full of training, battles, and secrets. He was no ordinary homeowner, no quiet neighbor to be pushed around. He was a man who had faced terrorists, cartels, and some of the darkest threats to his nation. And the men standing at his door, these fake officers with their cheap badges and cruel smiles, were about to learn that they had chosen the wrong man to target. Because Marcus wasn't just a black man mowing his lawn. He was the most feared field agent in the FBI. And today, they had knocked on the wrong door. Marcus stood quietly in his doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. The 2 fake officers didn't move back. Instead, they puffed out their chests as if daring him to argue. The taller one unfolded the wrinkled paper again and began reading in a harsh tone. "You've been reported for trespassing, noise violations, and making threats to your neighbors. These are serious charges," he declared, his eyes full of arrogance. Marcus listened, his face calm, though inside his chest a fire slowly burned. Trespassing? He owned this house. Noise violations? His lawnmower had only been running for 20 minutes. Threats? He had never once spoken harshly to any of his neighbors. Yet here he was, being painted as dangerous, just because these men decided he should be. He raised an eyebrow. "Noise violations? You mean my lawnmower?" His voice carried no anger, only disbelief. But the shorter one stepped closer, sneering. "Don't act smart. Everyone here is tired of you. You're scaring people. We've had complaints for weeks." Marcus's eyes moved slowly across the street. Curtains moved. More neighbors were peeking out, whispering to each other. A few stood with folded arms, nodding along as if the words were true. In their eyes, Marcus could see it. The quick judgment, the easy belief. They had decided already. He was guilty. It hurt more than he wanted to admit. He had lived on this street for 3 years, always polite, always quiet. He waved to people, helped old Mrs. Dawson with her groceries, even shoveled snow for the Johnson kids last winter. But none of that mattered now. One accusation, one staged performance, and every good thing he had done was invisible. The taller man smirked. "Look, you can make this simple or we can drag you out. Your choice." Marcus's jaw tightened. He felt his patience thinning, but he didn't want to let his anger show. He had spent his whole life learning how to stay calm, even when people tried to break him. His training in the FBI had taught him control, never give power to emotion, in the heat of a moment. But what stung wasn't the threat itself. It was the memory it carried. He remembered being 16, standing outside a corner store with his friends when a security guard had accused them of shoplifting. They hadn't stolen a thing, but the guard had made them empty their pockets, on the street while strangers stared. He remembered his mother's tears later, the way she had whispered, "One day, son, they'll see you as trouble before they see you as human." And now, standing on his own doorstep as a grown man, those words echoed back like a cruel prophecy. The shorter fake officer pushed the cuffs forward, the metal glinting in the sun. "Last chance. Step outside." Marcus didn't move. His deep voice came out steady but colder this time. "You don't belong here. You're not real police, and you're not taking me anywhere." For a split second, the men faltered. Something in his tone, something in the way he stood so tall and unshaken, unsettled them. But they quickly forced a laugh, trying to hide their nerves. "Oh, we belong here," the taller one spat. "We're cleaning up this neighborhood. People like you make it unsafe." The words pierced Marcus's chest like knives. People like you. He had heard it before, in airports, in boardrooms, in restaurants. But coming from men pretending to wear authority made it worse. It wasn't just prejudice, it was malice, dressed up in fake power. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying his breath. He wasn't afraid, not of them. What he feared was what his neighbors were seeing and believing. To them, he was already the villain. If he defended himself too quickly, they would think he was violent. If he stayed silent, they would think he was guilty. It was a trap carefully set, and it burned him inside to know it worked. But Marcus also knew something the two fake cops didn't. They thought they were in control, but they had no idea who they were standing against. They saw a quiet black man on his porch. They didn't see the man who had once taken down an entire crime syndicate in another country. They didn't see the man who had stared into the eyes of terrorists and never flinched. Marcus opened his eyes again, sharp and unyielding. "You've made a mistake," he said softly. The two men laughed cruelly, thinking he meant surrender. But in truth, Marcus wasn't warning them for his own sake. He was warning them for theirs, and soon they would understand just how big of a mistake they had made. The tension in the air grew heavier with each passing second. The neighbors were no longer just peeking from behind curtains. Many of them stood openly now, some holding their phones ready to record. They wanted drama, proof that the quiet black man on the corner wasn't as innocent as he seemed. Marcus stood calmly, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes locked on the two fake officers. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, in gangs, in corrupt leaders, in men who thought fear gave them power. These two were no different, except for one thing. They had picked the wrong man. The taller one suddenly shoved Marcus in the chest, hard enough to make him step back a little. "Don't test us," he barked. "We told you already, you're under arrest." Marcus didn't stumble. His feet planted firmly on the ground. His voice came out steady, quiet but sharp. "You don't have the right to touch me." The shorter officer smirked, clearly enjoying the show. "Oh, we have more than the right, we've got authority. And you're about to learn that people like you don't win when the law is involved." The words echoed through the street. Some neighbors nodded as if they agreed, their arms crossed, their eyes filled with judgment. Others looked uncertain, uncomfortable, but no one stepped forward to speak for Marcus. He was alone, at least to their eyes. But Marcus knew better. He had never been truly alone in moments like this. His training, his experience, and his instincts were with him. Every lesson he had learned in the field whispered in the back of his mind. Stay calm. Control the space. Never let them dictate the terms. He took a slow breath and studied them. Their uniforms didn't match any real agency he knew. Their boots were cheap, their cuffs weren't standard issue, and the way they carried themselves was sloppy. These weren't officers. These were criminals playing dress-up, men who thought a costume could give them power. But Marcus wasn't laughing. This wasn't a game. They had crossed a line, and in doing so, they had stepped into his world. The taller one leaned in close, his breath hot with anger. "I said step outside, now." Marcus's eyes didn't move. "And I said, you don't know what you're doing." The man pushed him again, this time harder. The crowd of neighbors gasped, a few voices rising. "Oh my God, he's resisting." Resisting. The word was dangerous. It could twist the truth in an instant. Marcus knew it well. He clenched his jaw, feeling the heat in his chest. He wanted to end this right now, to put these fools on the ground where they belonged. But his mind reminded him, too fast and the neighbors would only see violence. Too slow and the men might actually try something worse. The shorter officer laughed, pulling the fake cuffs from his belt. "This is it. You're done." Marcus looked at the cuffs, then back at the man. His deep voice dropped low, heavy with warning. "That's a mistake you don't want to make." They didn't listen. They thought his calmness meant weakness. They thought his patience meant fear. They had no idea that they weren't in control. The taller man reached for Marcus's arm, trying to twist it behind his back. But before his fingers even closed, Marcus shifted slightly, his movements smooth and precise. Years of FBI training flowed through him like instinct. His stance widened, his shoulders squared, his muscles ready. Still, he didn't strike. Not yet. He wanted to give them one last chance. He wanted to give the truth a moment to reveal itself. "You don't know who I am," Marcus said, his voice like steel. "And when you find out, you'll regret this." The two men laughed louder, their cruelty echoing down the street. To them, it was already won. To the neighbors, it looked like Marcus was cornered, about to be dragged away. But the truth was different. Marcus wasn't trapped. They were, and very soon, the two men pretending to be heroes would discover they had picked a fight with someone far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. The fake officers stood taller, thinking they had Marcus under control. The taller one gripped his shoulder again, trying to force him toward the steps of his porch. But Marcus didn't move. He stood like a wall, solid and unshaken. Around them, the neighborhood had fallen into a heavy silence. Only the sound of sprinklers and a barking dog down the street broke the stillness. Mothers clutched their children closer, some whispering words Marcus couldn't hear. Phones stayed raised, recording every second. Some neighbors looked curious, others looked nervous, but too many wore expressions of quiet satisfaction, as if they were glad to see this moment happen. Inside, Marcus's heart ached. Not because of the men in front of him. They were nothing. To him, small and untrained. No, what hurt was seeing his neighbors. People he had lived beside for years, people he had greeted each morning, people he had quietly helped without them even asking. And now, when he needed only a little faith, they gave him none. But Marcus had learned long ago not to expect fairness. He had lived through missions where the people he saved never knew his name, where his work was invisible. He didn't do it for thanks. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because it was right. And today, he would do the same. Whether his neighbors believed in him or not. The taller fake officer barked again, his voice sharp and commanding. "Step outside now, don't make us drag you." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. His voice dropped lower, quiet, but, "Friend, let me ask you one last time. What agency are you with? Who gave you the authority to come here?" The shorter man rolled his eyes, snickering. "You ask too many questions. Shut your mouth and get in the van." Marcus studied their faces. No hesitation, no fear, just arrogance. They truly believed the uniforms gave them power. They thought their lies would hold up under the weight of a badge. But Marcus saw through them. Their movements were sloppy, their confidence fake, their story full of holes. Still, Marcus hesitated. Not because he doubted himself, but because he cared about what the children across the street were seeing. Little eyes watching from behind their mothers' skirts, little faces pressed to windows. He knew they would remember this scene. A black man on his own porch, accused of crimes he didn't commit. They would remember how people judged too quickly, how silence can wound just as much as cruelty. He wanted those children to learn something different from this day. Not fear, not hate, but truth. Marcus straightened his back, his deep voice cutting through the still air. "This is your last warning. Walk away now, and you might still have a chance to save yourselves." The men laughed again, cruel and careless. The shorter one waved the cuffs in his hand, metal clinking. "You're not in charge here, old man, we are." But Marcus didn't laugh. His face was still calm, but inside, he was no longer patient. They had crossed every line. They had been given their chance. And they had chosen arrogance instead of wisdom. His instincts sharpened, like they had in countless missions before. He could hear the shift in their breathing, the weight of their steps on his porch. He could see the sweat on their brows, the slight twitch in their fingers as they tried to act braver than they were. All the signs told him one thing: this confrontation was about to end. But Marcus wasn't thinking about himself anymore. He thought of his mother's words warning him that the world would always see his skin before his soul. He thought of the agents he had trained beside, who trusted him with their lives. He thought of the people he had protected in silence, never knowing his name but safe because of his work. He would not let two criminals, dressed in lies, take that from him. Not today. Marcus inhaled slowly, his body still and controlled. The storm was coming. He could feel it, and when it broke, the world around him would finally see who he really was. The cuffs gleamed in the shorter man's hand, the metal catching the sunlight. He stepped forward with a grin, certain victory was his. The taller one moved to Marcus's side, ready to grab his arm again. The crowd across the street leaned in, phones steady, eager for the moment they thought would come, when Marcus would finally be dragged away. But instead, Marcus moved first. Not with anger, not with panic, with calm, steady precision. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small black leather wallet. The movement was smooth, practiced, almost casual. The fake officers froze, unsure whether it was a weapon. But when Marcus flipped it open, the golden badge inside glinted brightly. "FBI," Marcus said, his voice low but commanding. The single word cut through the street like a blade. The neighbors gasped. The fake officers blinked, their arrogant smirks cracking. Marcus held the badge firmly, letting them see every letter, every number. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he continued, his tone now carrying the weight of authority. "And you two just committed a federal crime, impersonating law enforcement." The shorter man stuttered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. You're lying, he muttered, but his voice had lost its confidence. Marcus stepped closer, his tall frame casting a shadow over him. His eyes were sharp, cold, the eyes of a man who had seen more than most could imagine. "Try me," he said quietly. The taller officer panicked first. He lunged forward, trying to grab Marcus's wrist and twist the badge away, but Marcus had already moved. With one swift motion, he caught the man's arm, spun him around, and dropped him face first, onto the grass. The sound of the man hitting the ground made the crowd gasp again. The shorter one stumbled back, his fake cuffs falling from his hand. For a second, he thought of running, but Marcus was faster. In a blur, he closed the distance, sweeping the man's legs and pinning him to the porch steps before he could even shout. Both men were now on the ground, groaning, their arrogance shattered. Marcus didn't even break a sweat. Every move had been controlled, efficient, professional. Years of training, of missions in hostile places, of capturing real threats. This was second nature to him. The neighbors stood frozen, their eyes wide. What they had expected to see was a man in trouble. What they were seeing instead was a man in command. The quiet neighbor they had judged so quickly was not a criminal. He was the one who hunted criminals. Marcus straightened, his badge still in hand. He looked at the two men writhing on the ground. His voice was calm, almost too calm, when he spoke. "You thought I was an easy target, a man you could humiliate, in front of his neighbors. But you picked the wrong house. I don't just arrest criminals, I train agents to track people like you. And believe me, I've put men far more dangerous than you in cells where they still sit today." The taller one groaned, trying to push himself up. Marcus pressed a firm hand to his back, keeping him down with little effort. "Stay down," Marcus ordered, his tone sharp, leaving no room for argument. The shorter one finally found his voice, though it trembled. We didn't know," he stammered. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "That's the problem. You didn't care to know. You thought a uniform and a lie would be enough. You thought fear would do the rest. But fear doesn't work on me." The silence in the neighborhood was heavy now. Even the children had stopped whispering. Everyone was watching, their phones forgotten in their hands. Marcus slowly looked up, his gaze sweeping over the faces around him, his voice carried steady and strong. "You all judged me without knowing me. You were ready to believe I was guilty before I even spoke. Remember this moment? Because the truth always comes out." He stepped back, pulling his phone from his pocket, already dialing. "Yes, this is Agent Marcus Kane," he said firmly. "I need local law enforcement here immediately. I have 2 suspects impersonating officers in custody." The crowd gasped again at the sound of his full name and title. Suddenly, Marcus wasn't just the man who mowed his lawn quietly. He was someone entirely different. Someone powerful, someone respected, someone dangerous to the wrong people. And for the 2 men lying in the dirt, it was the moment they realized their dangerous mistake had just ended their freedom. The sound of sirens broke the heavy silence of the neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed down the street, bouncing off the windows of every house. Real police cars came to a stop in front of Marcus's home, tires screeching. The neighbors shifted nervously, some lowering their phones, others whispering, as the officers stepped out. Marcus stood tall on his porch, one hand holding his badge, the other keeping the 2 fake officers pinned to the ground. His face was calm, but his eyes stayed sharp. He had been through this scene many times before, criminals caught, chaos unfolding, truth waiting to be revealed. The first real officer hurried up the path. His hand rested on his holster, his expression tense, until Marcus held his badge higher. "Special Agent Marcus Kane," he said firmly, his deep voice steady. "FBI, these 2 men are impersonating law enforcement. They attempted to make a false arrest." The officer froze for a moment, blinking at the sight of the badge. Then, he gave a respectful nod. "Agent Kane," he said. His tone changed immediately, firm but no longer suspicious. He turned to the 2 men on the ground. "You're under arrest for impersonating officers and attempted kidnapping." The shorter fake officer began to protest. No, we were... "Just quiet," the real cop barked. He cuffed the man quickly, this time with real steel, not the cheap toys they carried. The taller one tried to mutter something about just following orders, but Marcus's steady stare silenced him. As the suspects were pulled to their feet, the truth finally started to sink in for the neighbors. They murmured to each other, their voices low, guilty and confused. The same people who had been so quick to believe Marcus was a criminal now stared at him with wide eyes, unsure what to say. Mrs. Dawson, the elderly woman he had once helped with groceries, pressed a hand to her mouth. The Johnson kids, who had played in his yard when their ball rolled over, clutched their mother's dress, looking at Marcus with a mix of awe and fear. Even those who had folded their arms in judgment before now looked ashamed, avoiding his eyes. Marcus didn't gloat, he didn't shout or boast. He simply watched, silent, as the two men were placed into squad cars. He wasn't interested in proving himself to the neighbors. He had done his duty, nothing more. But inside there was still a sting. Not from the fight, not from the danger, he could handle that. What hurt was how quickly his neighbors had turned against him. How fast they had believed the worst. It was a wound deeper than any bruise. One of the real officers turned back to Marcus. "We'll take it from here, Agent Kane. Do you want to come down to the station to give a statement?" Marcus shook his head. "I'll file my report later. Right now, I just need some quiet." His voice was calm but heavy, as if carrying years of weight. The officer nodded with respect. "Understood. We'll make sure this is handled." As the cars drove away with the impersonators, the street grew quiet again, but the silence was different now. It wasn't judgment anymore, it was shame. The neighbors looked at Marcus, but most couldn't meet his eyes. Some opened their mouths, maybe to apologize, but no words came. Marcus finally broke the silence. His deep voice carried across the street. "You all saw what happened today. You were ready to believe I was guilty without a single question. You judged me before you knew the truth." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces around him. "I've spent my life protecting this country. I've stood against men who would destroy everything you take for granted. And yet, here, in my own neighborhood, I was treated as a threat for mowing my lawn." The words landed heavy. No one dared to respond. Marcus didn't speak out of anger. He spoke from truth, from pain, from years of carrying burdens people didn't see. And in that moment, the neighbors realized who he truly was. Not just the quiet black man on the corner, but a protector who had given more than they could ever know. With a slow breath, Marcus turned and walked back into his home. He closed the door gently, leaving the neighborhood in silence. Behind that door, he let himself finally exhale. He wasn't shaken by the fight. He was shaken by the reminder that sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with fists or weapons. They were fought with prejudice, with doubt, with the way people chose to see him. And though he had won today, Marcus knew the war for respect was far from over. The street was quiet long after the police cars disappeared with the two criminals. The neighbors drifted back into their houses slowly, their faces pale, their hearts heavy with guilt. But their silence remained, hanging in the air like a weight. For Marcus, silence had never been a stranger. He had lived most of his life in the shadows doing work no one thanked him for, work most people would never even know about. Inside his home, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his badge resting in front of him. The golden emblem caught the dim light from the ceiling lamp. He stared at it not with pride but with reflection. That badge had been both a shield and a burden. It had given him authority in the field, yet outside of it some people still refused to see beyond his skin. He thought about the day, about how quickly the situation had escalated. Two men in fake uniforms, a street full of neighbors ready to believe lies, and children watching something that could have turned tragic. It wasn't the fight that haunted him. It was the lesson the neighborhood had shown. There was a knock at his door again, this time softer, hesitant. Marcus rose and opened it. Standing there was Mrs. Dawson, the elderly woman he had helped so many times. Her eyes were wet with tears, her wrinkled hands trembling as she clutched a folded dish towel. Marcus. Agent Kane, she said, her voice breaking. I am so sorry. I stood there. I didn't speak up. I just believed them. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then gently shook his head. You don't need to call me agent. Marcus is fine, and you don't owe me anything. But I do, she whispered, her voice shaking. You saved us today. You've always been kind, and we doubted you. I doubted you, that's something I'll have to live with. He sighed softly. He could see the guilt in her eyes, the shame in her shoulders. What matters is what you do next, Marcus said gently. You saw what fear can do. You saw how quickly people judged. If you really want to make this right, remember this moment. Don't forget it. She nodded, tears falling, and placed the dish towel in his hands. I baked bread, it's the least I can do. Then she walked away, leaving Marcus alone again. Later that evening, Marcus stepped outside onto his porch. The air was cooler. Now the sky painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun set. Across the street, children peeked out from behind their windows. Adults pretended not to look at him, but he could feel their eyes. Finally, one of the Johnson kids, a little boy no older than 8, came out with his basketball. He bounced it nervously, then called out, Mr. Marcus, are you really FBI? Marcus smiled faintly. Yes, I am. The boy's eyes widened, filled with awe. That's cool. For the first time that day, Marcus let out a small chuckle. It's not always cool, but it's important, and sometimes important is better than cool. The boy grinned and ran back inside, shouting excitedly to his siblings. Marcus leaned against the porch railing, looking up at the darkening sky. He knew the neighborhood would never look at him the same way again. Some would carry guilt, some would carry shame, and some would carry respect. But Marcus didn't care for their opinions anymore. Respect to him wasn't about words or apologies, it was about actions, choices, truth. He whispered to himself, almost like a prayer. Strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits. Until the truth has no choice but to show itself. The wind rustled the trees, carrying his words into the night. Marcus turned and walked back into his house, closing the door gently behind him. To the world outside, he would remain the quiet man on the corner. But inside, within his own walls, he carried the knowledge of who he truly was. Not just a neighbor, not just a man judged by his skin, but an agent, a protector, a fighter who had faced enemies far stronger than 2 pretenders in cheap uniforms. And though his neighbors had doubted him, he knew the truth. He had not only defended himself that day, he had reminded an entire street that judgment is dangerous, and that sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one standing between you and real danger. Marcus switched off the porch light, leaving the street in quiet darkness. The storm had passed. The lesson remained, and the man they had almost thrown away was the very man they should have been most grateful for.